Hello, folks. Welcome to the Work Item Podcast. It's another week, and every week we're bringing you insights about careers and stories about careers from some of the most prominent folks in the industry. And we do have a prominent person in the industry today, which is Nick Wan, Director of Analytics for Cincinnati Reds. I think this is the first time we have somebody coming on the show that works with a sports team. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you. Hello.
It's so great to have you on the show. Last time we chatted, we were just mentioning this before the show was, I want to say, like more than a year ago on your
Yeah,
live stream.
that's right. I want to say it was like in January, so I think we got the month right.
Something like that. Yes. We'll need to ask Meg when that was. I'm sure she has a better concept of time than us. But so curious to learn about your careers. You are a prolific data scientist, and you know so much about data and analytics. What drew you to this specific field? Why data and analytics?
I was a neuroscientist. I was in grad school as a neuroscientist, doing my PhD, and in grad school, I had my postdoc lined up, and I was like, what would I leave my postdoc for? And I decided a job in sports would be great. So I applied to a ton of different sports teams, and the Cincinnati Reds called me back. So this was actually my first time out of academia. Was a data science role with the Cincinnati Reds, and then since then I had left the Reds. I had gone to work for KFC, and then I have come back to the Reds as the director of analytics now. So it's a back, I don't know, way back in the day before the term data scientist. I feel like I learned all the same or similar skills that a data scientist does through my neuroscience program. So I didn't feel like it was a big leap into the world of data science. I just felt like I was doing, research science still, just with, baseball instead of brains. But I feel like it's all one and the same once you get down to the data.
What's that overlap like? Neuroscience and data science. It seems to me, as somebody that's completely uninitiated in the field, that seems like such a leap, right? From one very complex domain to another very complex domain.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of overlap actually, and it starts with the statistics, right? So in psychological science and in neuroscience, there's a ton of statistics, and in data science, you're always validating models through statistics. You're always doing things based off statistical methodology or modeling. So just from the kind of the, if you want to reduce machine learning or reduce data science down to sort of its component parts, statistics is a really big piece of it. So it is the same in neuroscience. So that's where it kind of starts, and then the programming side of it also. Like when I was doing my PhD, a lot of that was in MATLAB. I then went from MATLAB, learned Python, and then jumped into the Python world. And a lot of data science jobs end up having people like me do stuff in Python as opposed to something like MATLAB or SAS. So just from the programming statistics point of view, it's relatively similar. You're still taking gigantic sets of data. You're processing data through programming language. You're creating outputs that have to be validated through statistics. The only difference in my mind is the visualizations at the end. I dealt with a lot of brains, so I plotted things on a lot of brain-looking plots. Now I plot a lot of things looking like I don't know, on the baseball field. So
This is absolutely wonderful. And speaking of baseball fields, the career path that you described is what I would say like non-traditional, because a lot of folks would stick with the typical FAANG companies, right? And a lot of them have very well developed data science and analytics arms. You're talking about the Meta of the world, Twitter, Microsoft, Google. You went with the KFC and Cincinnati Reds. Tell me more about what led you to that decision. Why not FAANG?
once again, like it stemmed from sort of just like passion and like interest areas. Like I was never really interested in chasing like going into tech or going into data science as like the title or the career. I was always more interested in domain specific projects like neuroscience, for instance. I was really interested in studying social dilemmas and game theory and how we think about things when we're processing game theorized or finite decisions through some sort of social space. It was never about like I want to be a neuroscientist. It was always more about the project. And that's the same with sports analytics. It's less about like wanting to work, say, at Amazon or say at Google, and it's more about wanting to work on a particular problem. And that problem, in my opinion, was like, how do we make players better through statistics? How do we optimize players' decision making or players' reaction times or players' physical peak performance through analytics, through statistics, through data science? And uh, when you go from the project point of view as opposed to the company point of view or the title chasing point of view, you end up in different domains, right? Like, for instance, if you want to work in sports, you're going to end up on a sports team. If you want to work in marketing, you're going to end up in a marketing company. And those aren't traditionally things like, your typical FAANG or I guess like, I have a conversation in my community. Is it FAANG now or is it like MANGA?
I think it's manga, right? Because it's
Really? Right. So that's so in my mind, like, yeah, if you go down a more, say, traditional route of what an engineer or what a computer scientist would go, they are typically targeting computer science or computer engineering jobs and titles and roles, and those are traditionally tech roles. But if you go down a path, it's a little more project based. I think you end up in places that are perhaps less traditional than your typical FANG manga companies.
also your perspective here is interesting because it's the opposite of the common perspective on careers. Because a lot of folks, when they come out of college, they come out of a boot camp, they always look like, I want to work at company X, I want to work at company Y. And not a lot of them are actually thinking about, I want to work on a project that, builds rockets to go into space. Like, some of them do, but the vast majority that I talk to always think about the company.
Yeah,
What can they do to shift that mindset?
yeah. It's interesting because I would say I would particularly for you, like when someone asks you like, oh, like how should I learn how to code? Like, this is a big question we all get, right? Like, someone's new and someone's a student. Like, how do I learn how to code? How do I learn Python? How do I like learn data science? And typically, my answer, which is the same as a lot of people's answer, is find a data set that's interesting to you and work on a problem from beginning to end. So, if you're interested in sports, for instance, if you might want to be in, like, you might want to know, can I predict how a batter will perform next year based off their previous data? Or I might want to know how someone in the NFL will throw, how many touchdowns they throw next year compared to their previous seasons. So when we talk about just even how we learn how to code, like take a project from beginning to end, well, like, why doesn't that particular information or that particular advice travel all the way through to the point of the career that they want? Like, when someone asks, like, oh, I have these skills, like, what careers or what companies should I work for? Which is kind of not a question people ask. The answer that you should kind of get to is like, what projects do you want to work on? And in my opinion, I think that's what's more meaningful to a lot of people at the end of the day. Like, a lot of people end up transferring between teams or transferring between companies because of the content of their work. And if you start with what you want to work on first, I feel like you're going to find so many different places that aren't specifically like these mainstream places that people want to work at, and they might be more fulfilling to you initially, or maybe in the long term. I know a lot of people end up finding like passion projects and they stay there for quite a long time, and I'm definitely one of those people. So perhaps that's where it comes from. Perhaps that's where the mindset starts.
I love the perspective because even what you talked about just now, learning how to code, again, this is one of those things that sometimes folks get a little backwards or like, oh, I want to learn how to code. I'm going to start reading a book from beginning to an end about this programming language instead of focusing on what project do you actually want to build. I don't know about you. Like, I learn when it comes to coding much, much faster if I want to build something. If I want to, like, you know what? I want to reverse engineer this application. How do I go do this? and then you start Googling, you go to Stack Overflow, you find a book or something instead of just, okay, I'm going to read every book on reverse engineering now.
Right. And like I always like people always ask me a similar question of like beyond just wanting to get into or wanting to become a data scientist or wanting to learn how to program, they also always ask me like how do I get into the sports industry? And it's the same answer at the end of the day. Like how do I become a sports analyst? How do I become a data scientist for a baseball team? It's the same answer. It's that answer is, you know, find the data set that you want to work on and learn how to program it at the end of the day. And it's so interesting that so many um, of these STEM related fields are now converging onto this point of like we need to focus on programming and coding at an earlier level of the degree program or the program of study. We need more access to programming and statistics education and knowledge from an earlier point of entry because that's becoming so much more and more important, not just in like baseball and not just in sports and not just in tech and data science, but like everywhere, right? We're seeing it in all industries now. That's including like fried chicken, right? That's including KFC.
There's, despite what people might think, it's not just a fast food chain. There's a lot of stuff that folks do in terms of customer analysis and making sure they understand what customers want, why they want it, at what times. There's just so much work that I can think of just right off the top of my head that needs to be done behind the scenes that it's, you don't see it, but it's happening, right? Like just like with sports, folks see a baseball game thinking, oh, look at this guy is playing really well. But look over the history of a year and then start making those predictions. It's much harder. It's under that surface.
That's right. I like KFC is a great example of like as you said, you're doing customer analytics, you're doing store analytics, you're doing product analytics. You're measuring the performance of a marketing campaign. You're measuring the performance of particular franchises or franchisees, and then that's just the U.S. part of it. There's also the global side of it. You know, global initiatives. Are there innovations in certain markets that are successful? Are there innovations in certain markets that are not successful? And these are all questions you can answer through, you know, data collection, data ingestion, data analysis, ultimately some sort of data science and predictive methodology, and that's all working under the hood. Yeah, like you said, and the it's no again. This is why I always go back to the idea that the jump from where I was in academia into baseball, into, you know, fast food, back to baseball. In my mind, it's always been the same. It's always been like what is that under the hood data structure, processing pipeline, analytical pipeline look like? And a lot of the times from field to field, it really is the same.
Well, and speaking of academia, something that I'm curious about, because a lot of folks have this concept that when you work in academia or when you do active research, it's all about the theory. Like in theory, it should be this. In theory, it should be that. And there's a lot of paper writing. And when you work in the industry, it's more of just like, we have no time for papers. Let's just make this happen. Let's write a bunch of code and get this out the door. How realistic is that? Is that a misconception that this is the difference, or is there more of an overlap?
So definitely writing papers. You're definitely doing that in academia. There's a lot of paper writing. There's a lot of grant writing, so you spend a lot of time writing grants. But and also in terms of industry, right? Like you and I both know, there's not a lot of paper writing. You're not researching things because they're interesting or fun to research. You're researching things because they need to be researched because they move, whether it's profit lines or whatever the measurability of your department is. Um, so the need is very different from both, right? One being like the pursuit of knowledge and education, and one being the pursuit of, you know, success or profitability, whatever the measure might be, and therefore the outputs are a little different. So in academia, you definitely don't spend a lot of time, say, doing things like automated pipelines, doing things like DevOps or machine learning ops, anything like that. Usually, it's like some person like me who's coding things up, and the notebook works once, and you write your paper and you hope it works again when you hit run again. But in industry, it's like if the your code goes through a peer review process, just like some sort of like paired programming or some sort of code review, and then your code is validated through some sort of QA check, and your queries are validated through QA checks, and all these pieces are making sure that consistency through your analytical pipeline is there, because at the end of the day, you have to like produce something, and it needs to be reproducible. It needs to scale. These aren't things in academia or research science that we typically care about, just because like the sample sizes I was working with as a neuroscientist was like I record 40 people, and then that's what I'm supposed to generate groundbreaking new information from, whereas like a typical data set at KFC, I'm working with like 40 million transactions, and it's like that's like small amounts of data in our case. So it's there's a lot of overlap, but there's also very stark differences.
So it's much easier to draw conclusive insights from kind of the industry point of view, just purely because if you're working on a product that is popular, you get, well, more data, which is kind of obvious, but it just makes the job a little easier because you're more confident in the insights that you get.
That's right. We always have that sample size issue. Like, I'm sure you get it a lot with like, what is a good sample size, right? Like, I know there's ways to ask these questions more statistically, like with a power analysis, but in terms of just gut feel, like, is 100,000 customers correct? Is 1,000 times a person does something, like, is that good enough for a representation of their true ability? These are a lot of these things. I feel like they're easier to answer in industry because you get those numbers. In academia, I'm like begging people to come in. I'm paying them like, here's $100 to sit in this chair for 2 hours. Please come into my lab, and you're barely getting 40 people at that point.
Are you still coding as director of analytics? Because to me, when I hear director, that means like, okay, you have a lot of responsibility of managing people, managing teams, and there's very little time for coding. How is that going for you?
Yeah, there is very little time for coding. I consider myself like 95% hands off keyboard. So a lot of management, a lot of overseeing my direct reports, a lot of communicating across to the other directors in our organization. But the 5% hands on keyboard, there is like some passion projects or pet projects that I have on the side. They're sometimes low lift, but if we get anything from it, it's exciting for people to see research in really experimental fields. And as being a neuroscientist, I just couldn't let my skills go to waste. So we still do a little psychology and neuroscience here at the Reds, and I'm the only one really pushing that experimental envelope on our end. And so any work I get done there, I think a lot of people are really appreciative of it. But it's not necessarily my main role, and no one's necessarily relying on me to produce these kinds of insights. So it's kind of a win-win. I still get to kind of code every now and then, and I get to use like some of my PhD, but it's definitely not my primary role. And truly, I do like the directing more than I do the hands-on. There's way better hands-on keyboard people now than I. Very happy that they're on my team. So. Yes.
The same way, every time I talk to the engineers that I work with, like, y'all are all smarter than me by magnitudes and magnitudes. But sometimes I still like to code. I like to get my hands with some product that we're building, or sometimes to fiddle with something that is completely useless, which leads me to the question. So, okay, you have the 5% to code and be hands on the keyboard. How do you keep your skills sharp given just the amount of management time that is being spent? Like, are there any tricks that you've learned in your career to make sure that you're aware of what's happening in the industry, what tools to use, and how to best use them, stuff like that?
It's interesting because there's a lot of people out there that are similar to me who don't necessarily think of their programming skills as just like a tool that they use from 9 to 5. A lot of people are out there like fun coding, right? Like whether it's advent of code or doing random Kaggle competitions or whatever it might be. For me, I do find myself doing a lot of coding on my live stream. So I stream every night from like 8:30 p.m. Eastern for about 4-ish hours, and I'm usually exploring sort of the new landscape there. I don't do it very well. I wouldn't consider myself any expert in anything, but I do like to dabble in new packages when they come out, new different visualization tools as they get deployed. A lot of my coding, all my coding is still in Python. It's funny because my entire data science team all works in R. So just being the one Python guy in the forest of R people is always funny and fun. But I still like pushing the envelope there, learning more about the technical side at more of a hobby point of view, not necessarily as a high stakes in my company and need to be the bearer of knowledge point of view. So I feel like that's how I do it, but I don't know. I feel like a lot of people approach this differently. Like some people like enjoy taking a semester and doing like courses, or some people like exploring like a Coursera kind of thing, or I don't know. There's a lot of different ways to do it. I just find myself like just like how I tell people, I find myself finding a data set I really like, and then trying to do something with some new tools.
Are there any fundamental skills that you feel are the most useful for somebody that wants to break into analytics and data science? Something that is, regardless of which college you go to, regardless of which job you work at, it's more about like a foundational one.
Yeah, I get this question a good amount. People want to make the jump from some programming centric field to data science. For people who are just like on the outside looking in, they hear of the title and they look it up on Glassdoor, they see what's going on. My best advice is take one semester of statistics, take intro to statistics, and if you like it, then you might like data science, because again, at the end of the day, a lot of the things that the data scientists end up doing is trying to create statistical models or validate their models using some sort of form of statistics. And you really have to you really have to know statistics to some extent. You can't just fake your way through statistics. The best way to do that is, in my opinion, just take a course. People think of like, oh, I don't want to go back to school, or I don't want to spend. Yeah, it's so weird. It's like, well, you got to learn these skills somehow, right? And who better than a professor of statistics to teach you? So that's what I would recommend. It's not even programming related at all, but I would say if you are interested in data science, then you should also be interested in statistics.
I'm curious if there's a path to working in data science and analytics without formal education, right? Because it seems it's a very intimidating field for folks that are very like, I personally love math, but I know a lot of folks that are just so like, the moment you tell them like there's math involved, they're like, oh no. And it's kind of like backs you up. But there's also a lot of beautiful things that you do in data science and analytics, like you said, with Python. Well, you start coding and you start visualizing data, which is, yes, there's a degree of math complexity to it, but it's not the only thing. So do you think that formal education is a prerequisite, or is there a way around that?
Okay, so two takes on this one. My one take, which is a personal take, is I myself was really bad at math and science when I was in high school, and before that, I was really a bad student in general. I didn't do very well at all. People don't believe me when I tell them I didn't do bad at all, but I promise you, if you look up my transcripts, they are not good from high school and before, especially in math and science. And so, in one hand, like, because I wasn't necessarily gifted or had an interest from an early age, and that didn't really occur to me through college up into like my third year at community college. um I would say that like that struggle of like finding what I was really interested in, that took like just as long. That actually took shorter in a weird way than me trying to find the realm of data science. So this is like on one side, like I'm a great example of like uh, you don't necessarily have to be into math or into science or do well in either to end up finding your way there. But I would also say that is like the harder path, right? That's like the path I was on. It took me like many more years than people who were actually interested in math, actually interested in science, to get to where I am. And I would say, I would suggest that if you are, if you're already not necessarily interested in science or not necessarily interested in math, it's going to be a pretty difficult field to get into. I can absolutely say it's going to take you maybe twice as long as everyone else to get into that field. I basically took that long to get into it, but I would say that it's not impossible, but you really like the thing that needs to drive you is something beyond liking math or liking science. And again, I think it does go back to the idea of like the projects you're interested in. Sometimes you just get a question and like, yeah, it like itches at your brain, and like you just want to like go back and like research it or study it, and you get to a point where like, okay, well, I can't do this on my own in Excel anymore. What's the next step? And then that kind of forces you into a path of like, oh, I guess I have to learn math now. And that was my experience. So it's possible, but you really need to have something else that's driving you.
Yes, that motivator is the best feeling that you can possibly have when it comes to our industry specifically, because I know that from my own experience, when it comes to figuring out like some kind of API or trying to figure out how an application works, and then just that kind of like like I can't sleep because I need to figure this out because I'm so close and I know that I'm gonna get to it, and then you just realize like, okay, I lack the knowledge in this one area, so I go find it.
That's right. And truly, I've lived my life this way. I've lived my life where, a question has itched my mind until I scratched it. So,
And then when you find a solution, it feels great because you're like, finally, yes, I got this and it works. So with those things, everything that you knew going into kind of the industry from academia, you had a lot of, I don't want to say kind of prep for the job you're in, but you had an idea of what you're getting into. You kind of had this picture, you had the skills. What's something that caught you by surprise going into data science and analytics that as you started working, you're like, huh, I guess it's not quite as I expected that to be? What was that moment?
yeah, I so as a self-taught coder, as a person who like learned Python after learning MATLAB, the world of MATLAB, at least a lot of the MATLAB I was exposed to, nothing was really in functions. And so like the first like small step, which in my mind looking back is like, oh my gosh, like that's a gigantic step. It was like just functionizing things, putting things into functions, and having like explicit functions for every little thing that you're doing. Like they teach you that in computer science and computer engineering. They definitely don't teach you that in neuroscience school. So that was a big like small thing in my mind, that like there was a huge disconnect between the stuff I learned and how I learned versus like what was expected of me in the industry. And then like the steps after that are just like monumental steps, like knowing what version control is, like being able to check code in and out. That was something where it was like, oh, I know of Git, I know of how to of version control, but I've never had to use it for any of my projects. And then having to do that like on a daily or like an hourly or by minute basis now, it's like, how did I not know this? But put learning it later in your career, it seems like it seems just like another thing, like another like, oh, you weren't quite there yet. You have to know version control. You have to know Docker. Like learning Docker was a thing where I was like, oh, this is a great way to like keep our environments not messing up local or not messing up the server. But now we have to learn it. So I think it's a mix of like the different tech stacks that you end up having to learn, whether like it flows through a DevOps team or whether it flows through like your own good coding practices, and then on top of that, just the constant need to learn new tech stack layers. So whether it's like learning Kubernetes instead of just doing things off like a local Docker, learning how to integrate with Snowflake and with Azure. These are different things that that it's a constant learning process. That was really surprising, I think.
The tech stack part is also one of the honestly like underrated components of our tech careers, because you hear about it and you're like, I don't need this. This is like I need to learn this, whatever. And then once you start trying it, you're like, why haven't I not been using this for the past 5 years? This is awesome. It's that kind of dilemma between I don't need this, it's too hard, it's too complex, versus oh my gosh, please give me more of this, exactly this.
Yeah, I like the way that it hit me like the hardest was through my entire PhD. I never used a database. Like it was just like CSVs, right? Like floating around in space. And I knew of databases, and I was like, oh, I don't want to have to learn how to write Spark or how to write SQL. That's just another thing that I don't want to learn. I have to do my PhD. Knowing now how integrated and how kind of keystone pulling data in is from different database sources, it's like, why didn't I learn this sooner? Like this is genius. I should have done this throughout my PhD.
Right? And stuff that actually makes your life easier. And you're like, if only I knew this and spent the time when I had the chance. So much better.
So much better.
So much better. So now I have a question for you. We talked about the projects. We talked about foundational skills. We talked about something you did not expect in your career and having that motivator for folks that want to pursue it. What's one piece of unconventional advice you'd give somebody that wants to follow in your footsteps? They listen to this episode and be like, I want to be like Nick. I want to become a director of analytics at some point in my career. What's something that you'd recommend?
Something that I find, okay, so something that I find a lot in tech. This is good. I don't know. This might be a hot take. I don't know.
I love hot takes. Fantastic. Let's go.
Something that I find a lot in tech is when people get promoted into managerial or leadership positions, it's usually based off the work they've done from a technical point of view, and it's not usually based off whether they're going to be a good leader, good manager. And something that's really important that I've found throughout many different paths I've seen now and many different friends I've made in the industry is a great manager or a great leader is someone who wants to be a great leader, someone who wants to be a great manager. And the best engineer might not necessarily be the best person to lead or the best person to manage. And so I spent a lot of my handful of years now crafting out how I want to be a leader, because that's ultimately the path I saw for myself is less hands-on keyboard, more understanding the technology, understanding data science, and being able to, see a vision long-term or be able to plan out project roadmaps and be able to grow people and identify their skill sets. And I think what's important is to one, like asking yourself if that's something you want to do, and two, building in intention and intentionality into your current job to get you those skills. So really fighting for becoming a better leader. It's something that is like not necessarily a part of a lot of people's program. It's not a part of a lot of people's responsibilities or workflow or sprint plans, as like, are you doing things that allows you to contribute as a decision maker or leader in some process? Are you overseeing like an intern program? Are you a part of some sort of onboarding process or hiring process? Are you doing things in terms of documentation and being able to disseminate information or communicate information outward? These are things that a lot of people in my position end up having to do. But if you come from a strictly technical background, you might not have been exposed to those things, and then you're thrown into the fire of like, okay, now you have to talk to 20 people a day, and you have to be very good at communicating your results. And if you're not spending time to work on that before you get there, uh, you're gonna have some rough road ahead of you until you kind of you know become a great communicator.
I love that. I love the perspective of the skill set shifts when you get into managerial positions, because it's not just about your technical capabilities. And an interesting thing that's happening too is what I've noticed is as folks get into these managerial positions and they grow in their career as leaders, it's kind of converging across roles. If you're an engineering manager, you're a product manager lead, you're a director of analytics, there is such a huge overlap between those that is not there when you think about, okay, there's an engineer and the data scientist. They kind of do different things. But the more you grow on the career ladder, the more they kind of become similar, very like scarily similar.
Yeah, like especially when it comes down to just like from the people growing perspective, like what do they like? What does an individual want in their career path? And it's like, oh, I want to go from this role into a senior role into a principal role. And yeah, that's the same for whether you're like a database person or whether you're some sort of UX UI person. It's always sort of the same kind of laddered system, but the technicalities or the projects might be slightly different. And so I agree, like that managerial aspect from a technical perspective, you really do want to like, gain skills at being a good leader. And if you aren't yet, anyone listening to this, if you aren't, ask your manager how.
Ask your manager how. Great advice from a great person. Nick, where can folks find you online and learn more about what you're doing?
You could find me in a few different places. Twitter is a good place to get to me. That's twitter.com/nickwan, NICKWAN. You could also find me on Twitch, where I stream Monday through Thursdays. That's twitch.tv/nickwan, NICKWAN _datasci, DATASCI.
Nice. And it is a must-see live stream, so do go there, do subscribe, do watch the live stream. Nick, it's been a pleasure catching up with you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Yeah, this was so fun. Thanks for having me on.